Hello, and welcome to the 21st Century Academic Forum Conference at Harvard University, 2016. My name is Lorenzo Cherubini. I am a professor at Brock University, Faculty of Education in St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada, and I'm also the former director of the Tecumseh Center for Aboriginal Research and Education at Brock University. I very much wish I could have joined you all at the conference this year, but previous commitments have determined otherwise. Thank you for taking the time to sit through and peruse this conference presentation. It's entitled The Truth and Reconciliation Committee's Report, The Enactment of Policy. The report was commissioned in 2008 in Canada, and it was guided under the terms of the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. More broadly, one might suggest that too many Canadians know little or nothing about the historical roots of conflict that served in many respects as the impetus for both the settlement agreement and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work. Reconciliation, according to many of those involved in the work of the Commission, is not, however, necessarily about closing one of the darkest chapters of Canadian history, the residential school era, but more so about opening new healing pathways of reconciliation in support of truth and justice. The purpose of this presentation will be to, albeit briefly, discuss some of the hallmark policy initiatives, mostly historical and one contemporary, that have lent themselves to the evolution of residential schools and to the legacy that they have left on the current generation of Aboriginal peoples, and in fact, all Canadians. The work of the Commission was guided by two principal mandates, and here I refer specifically to the report. The first mandate was to reveal to Canadians the complex truth about the history and the ongoing legacy of the church-run residential schools in a manner that fully documents the individual and collective harms perpetrated against Aboriginal peoples, and honors the resilience and courage of former students, their families, and communities. And second, the mandate is to guide and inspire a process of truth and healing leading towards reconciliation within Aboriginal families and between Aboriginal peoples and non-Aboriginal communities, churches, governments, and Canadians generally. The process, according to the report, was to work to renew relationships on a basis of inclusion, mutual understanding, and respect. In terms of the Canadian policy context, although there were a number of policies predating the 1800s, I've chosen to begin the focal point of the presentation at least from the policy perspective with Egerton Ryerson's policy statement in 1847. Ryerson was the superintendent of schools for Upper Canada at the time, and he was the one who recommended to the government of the day the establishment of residential schools where Aboriginal students would be instructed in the English language in various ways of arithmetic, geometry, knowledge of forms, geography, general history, natural history, the writing and the drawing of vocal music, and bookkeeping, especially in reference to farmers' accounts. Ryerson's policy recommendation also included instruction, however, in the subjects of religion and morality. Secondly, the Federal Indian Act in 1876, quite similar to earlier pre-Confederation legislation, defined four Aboriginal peoples who was and who was not considered an Indian under Canadian law. The Act defined a process by which an Aboriginal person could in fact actually lose their status as an Indian. Interestingly, one of the conditions for an Aboriginal person to in fact lose their status as an Indian on Canadian land was by graduating from a university. Certainly a policy that is noteworthy in this a policy context. The next point that I think is particularly valid was the fact that all of these policies, and then the ones that followed, were in many respects more than simply a process in which to educate Aboriginal peoples. They were in fact more than a means by a post-colonial, imperial, and Eurocentric government to educate First Nations people. From the perspective of the report, these policies and the ones that followed were considered an integral part of an intentional policy of cultural genocide. Cultural genocide, as defined by the report, is as follows. It is the destruction of those structures and practices that allow the group to continue as a group. States that engage in cultural genocide set out to destroy the political and social institutions of the targeted group. Land is seized and populations are forcibly transferred and their movement is restricted. Languages are banned. Spiritual leaders are persecuted. Spiritual practices are forbidden. And objects of spiritual value are confiscated and destroyed. And, most significantly to the issue at hand, families are disrupted to prevent the transmission of cultural values and identity from one generation to the next. In this light, in 1883, Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada's first Prime Minister, told the House of Commons that, quote, "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write." Canadian policy regarding Aboriginal peoples extended well into the 1900s. In 1920, the then Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs, Duncan Campbell Scott, outlined his policy that informed a parliamentary committee that, quote, "Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politique. 1969 was the year that marked the federal government's Statement on Indian Policy, more commonly referred to as the White Paper, which in effect looked to bring an end to Indian status and to terminate the various treaties that were negotiated between the Canadian government and many First Nations people. That policy was met with profound resistance by a number of Aboriginal leadership groups. In 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper issued a formal apology on the floor of the House of Parliament to all Aboriginal peoples for Canada's role in the colonial assimilation and assimilist practices that were a hallmark of residential schools. The report of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee makes explicitly clear that despite the policy initiatives of the post-colonial Canadian government, Aboriginal peoples have not relinquished their unique identities, nor have they surrendered the distinctness of their worldviews. As the report suggests, it is time to commit to a process of reconciliation. By establishing a new and respectful relationship, we restore what must be restored, repair what must be repaired, and return what must be returned. In this way, the sentiments of the countless numbers of survivors of the residential schools have shared their anecdotes and testimonies. The report does not suggest, however, that the path to reconciliation will be an easy one. It recognizes the fact that far too many Canadians know little and in some instances relatively nothing about the historical roots and intergenerational consequences that were an outcome of residential schools. As the report states, history plays an important role in reconciliation. To build for the future, Canadians must look to and learn from the past. End of quote. This presentation suggests, however, that Canadians must be willing to do so, that Canadians must have the courage to see things for what they are, and that the next step is for the Canadian public to reply to the truths and documentation included in this report. The words of an Anishinaabe Elder, Mary Deleary, seem to be particularly fitting. She states, "I'm so filled with belief and hope because when I hear your voices at the table, I hear and know that the responsibilities that our ancestors carried are still being carried. Even through all of the struggles, even through all of what has been disrupted, we can still hear the voice of the land. We can hear the care and love for the children. We can hear about our law. We can hear about our stories, our governance, our feasts, and our medicines. Our relatives who have come from across the water, non-Aboriginal people, you still have work to do on your road. The land is made up of the dust of our ancestors' bones. And so to reconcile with this land and everything that has happened, there is much work to be done in order to create balance." End quote. The question becomes, however, according to whose definition of balance? At this point in the presentation, it may be best to allow the words, the testimonies, the anecdotes of the survivors themselves to describe how policy was enacted upon countless numbers of Aboriginal children. Larry Beardy, whose experiences of residential school were located in Manitoba, describes his journey by train of over 1,200 kilometers. He says, as soon as the children realized that they were leaving their parents behind, the younger children started crying. At every stop, the train took on more children, and they would start to cry as well. That train, I want to call that train of tears. Wilbur Abrams, from another example from a different school in Alert Bay, tells us how he climbed up the steps behind his sisters, and his sisters started following him. Then he felt a staff member pulling him by the ear, telling him to turn the other way. He states, I have always believed that I think at that particular moment my spirit left. Consider too this anecdote. Malvina McNabb, at 7 years old, says, I couldn't talk a word of English. I talked Cree, and I was abused for that, hit, and made to try to talk English. Raymond Hill, a student in Brantford, in the early years of the 20th century, I believe, shares that, I lost my language. They threatened us with a strapping if we spoke it, and within a year I lost all of it. They said they thought we were talking about them, in reference, of course, to the school teachers and school authorities. In another testimony, the report states the following. It was not uncommon for residential school students, traumatized by being placed in such a harsh and alien environment, to wet their beds. These students were subjected to humiliating punishments. Wendy LaFond said that at Prince Albert, a school located in Saskatchewan, if we wet our beds, we were made to stand in the corner of our pissy clothes, not allowed to change. Don Willie, another student at Alert Bay School, stated the following, and they used to line up the wet bed, the bedwetters, and line them up in the morning, and parade them through breakfast, the breakfast area, pretty much to shame them. But the abuse was not restricted to physical punishment and psychological torment. There were also anecdotes and stories of sexual abuse. Josephine Sutherland, cornered by one of the brothers, one of the missionary teachers in the Fort Albany school, shares, I couldn't call for help. I couldn't. And he did awful things to me. Other students, and now again I read from the report, recalled being assaulted in the church confessional. A student in the change room would suddenly have a bag pulled over his head. The abuse could begin with an instruction to report to the shower room in the middle of the night, or to take lunch to a staff member's room. An abusive staff person might stalk a student, blocking his or her way, or grope a passing student. Female students spoke of how some staff members took advantage of their innocence, rubbing against them sexually while they were sitting on their laps. This presentation has suggested that a profound impact of the Truth and Reconciliation report is the outcome of the enactment of policy on a generation of Aboriginal peoples who endured the residential school era. Moreover, the sad legacy remains for the generation that came after. One can see the impact of the residential system on the number of disrupted families and the number of Aboriginal children who remain under the custody of child welfare agencies. We see in our contemporary education practices and policies of achievement gaps that perpetually situate Aboriginal learners among the lowest achieving students across provinces and across the country. The various pathologies that affect Aboriginal people's health are also clear indicators of intergenerational consequences of disrupting families, of disrupting families' lives, and of disrupting families, their life, and the very communities from which they came, and the vitality that those communities lent to generations of Aboriginal peoples. We also see, of course, in the incarceration rates, here too, across many of the provinces, of the disproportionate number of Aboriginal peoples who continue to be incarcerated. I will conclude the presentation in the words of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report. It states, "Residential schools are a tragic part of Canada's history, but they cannot simply be consigned to history. The legacy from the schools and the political and legal policies and mechanisms surrounding their history continue to this day. This is reflected in the significant educational, income, health, and social disparities between Aboriginal people and other Canadians. It is reflected in the intense racism some people harbor against Aboriginal people, and in the systemic and other forms of discrimination Aboriginal people regularly experience in this country. It is reflected, too, in the critically endangered status of most Aboriginal languages." Thank you.